Hello.
Hi, Deborah. How are you?
Okay, how are you?
Baruch Hashem. 1 second. Okay. Just have to check the YouTube. Okay, Devorah, how do you manage without a cell phone?
I would ask you, how do you manage with it? Don't you find that you're checking it when you shouldn't? Don't you find that when you're with people, you're looking at it instead of them? Don't you find it pulls you away from nature because you're busy with it? Don't you
No.
find that you're thinking that it's important when it wasn't? Wasn't to you when you were 20 years ago. So what changed?
Oh, I'm on the phone by teaching. I need to. Do you speak on the phone to? You have like a regular landline?
Of course.
In my job, I'm on the phone all the time.
So your phone could be a landline or it could be a cell phone. It'd be equal. It's equal.
No, I'm not. It's just interesting that you don't have a phone. It's an interesting thing. Okay, so I think I'm going to just start speaking now because we have a lot of people who registered but who are not here. So you're going to be the live audience, and I'm going to give the shir. And Ezrat Hashem, it will go out to all the registrants. Okay, so first of all, this is the first of the Zman and Shevach, and the class. What I'm trying to do, since I wanted to fit in with the program of the Shevach philosophy, which was to do something unusually artistic and creative in this year. I'm not going to sing and dance or any of that stuff. But what I will do is incorporate some of the teachings that we learned about the elements and try to look at the part. It's a Parsha class, but it's a Parsha class looking with an eye on how we can see the elements in the Parsha and how we can deepen our understanding of the elements by some of the events in the Parsha, some of the mitzvahs in the Parsha. So it's Parsha Shoftim, Tavshin Pei Aleph, a few more weeks till the end of the year. And the Parsha of the four elements, so just a quick review of the four elements for those who would like a quick review. So the Torah tells us that the world was created, and everything that's created in the world is made up of a different combination of earth, air, fire, and water. That's the four elements mentioned in Pasuk Beis and Pasuk Gimel of Bereshis, the second and third verse of the beginning of the Torah, is the four elements. And throughout the Talmud and throughout the literature of Chazal, teachings and commentaries, the Arba Yesodot or Daled Yesodot are repeatedly mentioned again and again. And so we began learning about this when Rav Itamar Schwartz wrote his book, Getting to Know Your Soul. So we began learning about this and expanding into the personality and trying to see how the four elements in our personality manifest. What's the earth element or the earth part of us, etc. So just a quick review. The earth element is the most practical element. The water element is the emotional element in a person. The air element is the thinking intellectual part of the person and also the communication part. And the fire element is the spiritual part of the person. That's like a Bekitsur Nimras. It's like a crazy way to summarize it because it's missing so much. But that's the 4 categories. And if you look at every single mitzvah that we have, will be a majority of them, will be a tendency or a predisposition towards strengthening one of these elements. For example, as women, we take Shabbos in by lighting candles, by lighting Shabbos candles. So the Shabbos candles is fire. Clearly, it's a fire element. So we're bringing in Shabbos with the fire elements. We're also making the bracha on the candles, which is the air element, because we're using the power of communication and speech. And then afterwards, we, depending on different, what your situation is, either you sing Kabbalah Shabbat, Kabbalah Shabbos, or you don't, you set the table, whatever it is, then comes the meal. And the meal is, of course, the water element. And the earth element is the actualization of all of these things. The fact that on Friday, on Erev Shabbos, we're getting everything ready and prepared, that's an earth element. Misha Tarach be'Erev Shabbat, a person who works on, who gets busy and prepares on Friday, Hu Yochal b'Shabbat, he will have what to eat on Shabbos. And so you could look at life, and you can divide life up into so many different ways. But this is one way to divide up life and to categorize things. So, and as with the Baal Shem taught us, and really as Moshe Rabbeinu taught us, because Moshe Rabbeinu was the one who instituted reading the Torah on Shabbos. Did you know that? Moshe Rabbeinu made a takana. He instituted this halacha of reading the Torah every Shabbos. Chazal, Ezra HaSofer, instituted reading the Torah on Mondays and Thursdays and Shabbos Mincha in the afternoon. And so, really, because really the only Torah Midoraisa, the only time we read the Torah Midoraisa is Parsha Zachar, right? Zachar is Yom Shabbos. Zachar is Asher Salach Amalek, the Shabbos before Purim. That's the Doraisa of the Torah reading. And Moshe Rabbeinu made one of the first Rabbanans, a takana of Rabbanan, to read the Torah on Shabbos. And the way that he divided up the Parshios is divine. And in the Sefer Torah, you know that there's simanim of how to divide the Parshios. Sefer Torah does not have like paragraphs or, punctuation, but it has spaces. And the way the Parshios are spaced out, that's how we know between Parshas HaShavua to Parshas HaShavua. I learned years ago, it says in the Gemara, I think it says, and I haven't found the source. I just learned it in the Sefer, but I haven't seen the source. I have to actually look for that source. That in the times of the Beis HaMikdash, they would finish the Sefer Torah once every 3 years. Now, we finish the Sefer Torah, we read it once a year. The Parshios is divided up in such a way that we read one a week, and we finish once a year. And so the Baal Shem HaKadosh taught us that the way that the Parshios and that we read the Sefer Torah now is such that the energy of the Parsha is in the week, and is in current events, is in a person's life, a person's personality, a person's individual, whatever they're going through. That's all. If you know how to read the Parsha, you can find everything in the Parsha. That's what the Baal Shem HaKadosh said. And that's why the Chabad Hasidim take it even to a further degree. And they say that if you read the Aliyah of the day will give you a heads up on the energy of the day. And in fact, years and years ago, I don't know if this is still true, I don't think it is, but years ago, I remember that whenever Rabbi Yitzchak Ginsburg Shlita would give a shiur, he would get whatever it was. If it wasn't for his particular chevra, but if it was some group asked him to give a shiur, then he would, and they gave him the carte blanche on the topic, then he would just look at the aliyah of the day and give a shiur on the aliyah, whatever the day was. He would look at the aliyah, that section of the parsha that was corresponding to the day of the week, because as you know, the 7 days of the week, each one has the parsha HaShavua, the Torah portion of the week, is divided into 7 sections, and each section corresponds to a day of the week. So, for example, now is Yom Chamishi. It's still daytime here in Eretz Israel. So now it's Yom Chamishi, it's Thursday. So if I was doing this type of a shir without a topic, in other words, a one-time deal, I would just look at Yom Chamishi and somehow use that as a jump start to um, to whatever to speak about. So that's how you look at the parsha. That's one of the many, many ways to look at the parsha. There are many people who Motzei Shabbos, the custom is, Ezra HaSofer made the custom, to on Mincha of Friday, of Shabbos, Mincha Shabbos, you read the first aliyah of the next week's parsha, And one of the thoughts behind that, perhaps, is, and many people therefore Motzei Shabbos read the aliyah, the parsha of the whole week. They read the whole next week's parsha just to get an idea of what's going to be happening and how to prepare yourself for the events of the next week. Okay, so in my topic here that I'm just going to play with a little bit. So the Parsha Shoftim. So if you read through the whole Parsha, you'll see that it's all about halacha. It's all about different laws. The first law, of course, and the name of the Parsha is to make a shofet, to make shoftim, judges and shotrim, law enforcement officers, to in every sha'ar and in every shevet, in every city and town and tribe. And these people will be the judges, and they will make sure that everyone is behaving according to the law. And they're told that they have to be very honest, have integrity, not take bribes. They have to be rich so that they don't want to take bribes. And the Torah tells us that hashochad ye'aver einei chachamim, bribery can actually twist the eyes, blind the eyes of the wise, v'salef divrei tzadikim, and take the words of tzadikim and corrupt them. Okay, so now the Torah doesn't say that bribery will blind the eyes of judges and corrupt the words of judges or justice officers. It says chachamim and tzadikim. You don't get called a chacham or a tzadik, a wise person or a tzadik, at random in the Torah. That means even tzadikim, if they take a bribe, their judgment is clouded. Now, a bribe doesn't have to be just money to a personal person. A bribe can be any form of a favor that is given. Even a compliment could be a bribe. And immediately a judge who is complimented, or a rav who receives any form of benefit from anyone, has to disqualify himself from ruling on whatever he's being asked to rule on. Okay, so now you know that right now it's a very crazy hot topic in the world and it's a very controversial topic is this happening in the world today in terms of governments, in terms of medical decisions? Who is making decisions and how much self-interest is there in the decisions that they're making? Should they have disqualified themselves from offering opinions because they have interests? Anyone who has any financial gain from anything has to absolutely disqualify himself or herself from offering an opinion on that particular product. And yet we see that the world now is absolutely being bombarded with an argument back and forth. Who do you listen to? Who do you trust? Is this person have complete honesty? Is it absolutely incorruptible evidence? Or is everything being interpreted in the eyes of people who have a reason for their specific interpretation. So I'm not going to really talk more about that, because Hamevin Yavin, a person has to really, really understand deeply and figure this out on their own. But the Torah tells us that the greatest of people, if there's a self-interest involved, then they can be corrupted. Okay, so the beginning or misled, certainly not on purpose, but all of us are bribed by our Yetzer Hara all the time. We're regular people. We're not tzaddikim, we're not chachamim, we're just regular people. But people who are in positions of authority, how in the world are they supposed to soul search to the point where they can testify that they're not in any way affected or have a self-interest in the psak that they give? So I'll tell you an interesting story that somebody said about his own father. A person this is a certain teacher was saying that his own father was in a court case, was in a din Torah, and didn't say about what. And after and the court case had to, have like part 2 and whatever. There was a second session that they had to meet. So the part 1 of the court case had been completed, and they left the court, the Rebbetzin. And when they left the Rebbetzin, it started pouring. So this person said that his father, who was a litigant in this court case, had an umbrella, and he opened the umbrella and he put it over himself and actually over one of the rabbanim who was walking out. They were just all walking out of the building, and it was pouring. So he just opened the umbrella and held it open for whoever wants, for the guy who was walking next to him, who happened to be the Dayan on the case. And the Dayan, the Rav, said to him, "Thank you very much. And I now have to disqualify myself from being on your court because he just did me a favor." And the man didn't think, like, he just, by nature, it was raining. You open the umbrella, you put it next to whoever's, getting poured on. And the Dayan has so much integrity. The judge had so much, he was a Rav, the rabbi, the rabbinical judge. It was a rabbinical court. Had so much integrity that he said, "Thank you so much. I appreciate it, but now I can't serve as a judge because you saved me from a few droplets of water." Ad kedei kach. That's really honesty and integrity. Because the guy did him a favor. So now can he really rule against him completely? Is his judgment completely pure? Okay, so that's the beginning of the Parsha. The rest of the Parsha talks about actual practical laws. The practical laws of idolatry and, wiping out idolatry in Eretz Yisrael. And magic, and wiping out magic in Eretz Yisrael, of people who don't do things like that, and creating, again, justice systems, and making a king, and all the laws of the king, and then giving the Kohanim their charity, supporting the Kohanim, supporting the Leviim. How to wage war, etc. All of the rest of the whole parsha is details of halachas. Now, halacha is an earth element, and in fact, when people want to see what their nature is in terms of how they like to learn and what topics interest them, so you can have in a person's personality, one of the 7 parts of the personality is how do you think, and how do you communicate, and how do you learn? What's your learning style? This is a very, very important thing for teachers to know, because anyone who's been a teacher of children, I've been privileged to be a teacher for many, many decades, and I can tell you that no class it can only be taught in one way. A teacher who understands this idea of the 4 elements must incorporate all 4 elements into every shiur, into every class. They have to be fun. They have to be factual. Fun is water. Factual is earth. They have to be imposing their authority a little bit, that's fire. And they have to be giving over information that's relevant and interesting, that's air. And they have to juggle all of these four elements to satisfy every child or every student in that class. Because everyone, you have a class of however many people, and some of them are earth element learners, and some of them are fire element learners. And you really need to be able to pay attention and give everyone what they need. Sometimes a teacher who knows the elements can figure out, let's just say, for example, you have a small group and everybody is an air element in the group. So the teacher doesn't have to do any theatrics, just has to talk and give over ideas, and everyone will be satisfied. And so, and so when a person likes to learn halacha, halacha is an earth element topic. Some people will read Parsha Shoftim and will say like, oh, like they don't really get inspired from it because there's no stories, there's no drama. It's just halacha, it's just laws and laws and laws. So, and there are people who thrive on this. Why? Because they need to have, that's how their brain thinks. Their brain thinks in boxes. Their brain thinks in practical ideas. And so they thrive on this. It's interesting because when people learn Talmud, the Gemara, so there's a book called Ein Yaakov. There's a sefer called Ein Yaakov. What's Ein Yaakov? The Ein Yaakov is a compilation of all the stories in the Gemara, because the Gemara has mostly the discussion of laws and the derivation of laws and the trying to figure out. The rabbi is sharing with us how they determined or how the oral Torah came down through them. They're sharing that with us. That's what the Talmud is. But every once in a while, you have a Agadah on the Talmud. You have a story about what happened, about what different rabbanim are trying to tell you what happened to them, and because of what happened to them, they figured out a certain halacha, or some just stories of Tanakh. So the Ein Yaakov is a sefer where I forgot who compiled it. I forgot. He just took out all the stories from the Gemara. And the Rambam, what did the Rambam do? The Rambam took out all the laws of the Gemara and made a list of them. Mishnah Torah, right? And so some people like Agadata, so some people like the halacha, and some people like the pilpul, the figuring out of how the derivation of the halacha comes. So this parsha is all earth. However, the earth element works very, very opposite with the air element. Earth and air are opposites of each other. And so I want to focus on one topic in the parsha that has a very, very strong air element, even though it's an earth element. And I just want to show you how it plays together. So in our parsha, tells us about a king. When the Jewish people come into Eretz Yisrael, Hashem says, you're going to ask for a king. And you're going to ask for a king. And so this is in Parak Yud Zayin 17, Psukim from Yudalit on. It's the beginning of Sheni. It's the beginning of the Aliyah for Sheni, for the second day of the week. It would be interesting. What day of the week did the governor of New York resign? I wonder what day of the week that was, because it's so interesting that he resigns in humiliation in the Parsha of Shoftim. The Parsha of Shoftim, which talks about how a judge and a leader has to be more moral and have impeccable credentials, impeccable integrity. And so Dafka this week, this guy who was accused of all kinds of impropriety, the governor of New York, and he had to resign. Now, this governor of New York, I'm not quite sure, Baruch Hashem, I don't live there, I am not quite sure if the Jewish people were so fond of him. I think that he had a little bit of nasty comments to say for a good number of weeks or months about our communities. So look at that. Hashem just took them off in a very embarrassing way. That not just one or two women came with complaints. A lot of women came with complaints. Now again, what do we know about? What do we know about politics? What do we know about who wanted to get him out of office? Could be that he himself has a lot of enemies. And it's very easy to get people to say things. Nowadays, when anyone says any kind of an accusation, right away, there's no trial. It's right away, you're guilty until proven innocent. It's the exact opposite of how it's supposed to be. Whatever it is, when that happened, I was laughing like, okay, Parsha Shoftim, clear. You don't need too many. You don't need to be a prophet to see how that worked in. But let's look about the king. When you come to the land of Eretz Yisrael that God is giving you, you're going to inherit the land. You'll dwell in it. And you're going to say, Hashem is telling us what we're going to say. Asima alai melech. I want to put a king. I want to make a king. Like all the nations around me. Now, when we actually said this in the time of Shmuel Hanavi, when the Jewish people said this line, so Hashem got angry at us and said, you should have said, I want to put a king because it's a mitzvah in the Torah. Because the Rambam says that the 3 mitzvahs when you come into the land of Israel, you have to, number 1, get a king. So that number 2, he can destroy Amalek, and then 3, he could build the Beis Hamikdash. That's halacha. It's written in the Gemara. That's in Sanhedrin, in the Gemara Sanhedrin. So you need a king, because you need a king to get yourself an army. The job of the army is going to be to wipe out Amalek, and then to establish Hashem's Malchus in the Beis Hamikdash. But we gravitated more towards, we want a king so that we can be like everybody else. We want a king so that we can have a government like every nation needs a government. The highest level, and the Torah says, I know you're going to say that. The Torah warned us. You're going to say you want a king like everybody else, but that's not what you're supposed to say. You're supposed to say, I want a king so that we can fulfill all the mitzvahs of Eretz Yisrael in an organized way to serve Hashem. Anyway, here's the myth of the king. So Hashem says, so I'm letting you make a king. I'm going to pick the king, says Hashem. You can choose only a Jew to be a king. You can't take a non-Jewish king, which was a big problem later for Herod, right? He was not Jewish. And now, there's going to be a king. Okay. And the king now has halachas. The laws of the king. What's the laws of the king? He can't have too many horses because horses will bring you back to Egypt because Egypt is the place of horses. Right? Can't go back to Egypt. Nashim can't have too many wives. He can have 18 wives. That's a lot. Not more than 18. Why? Because he'll be too distracted. The chesed is and he's allowed to be very rich, but not too rich. And all of this has to be mitigated by v'haya cheshivto al kisei mamlachto, when he's on his throne. The chatavlo et mishnei hatzara, he has to write hazot. He has to write 2 sefer Torahs. I'll say for 2 sefer Torahs. One he has to keep with him at all times, like a little one, and one he has to keep in his throne room. And v'chatavlo mishnei hatzara hazot al militha konim halavim. And he has to write the sefer Torah and keep it with him. And the Kohanim Leviim have to always be around him because they are the holy ones. The Karabo, he has to learn the Torah, Kol Yimei Chayav, his whole life. All the time he has to have this little Sefer Torah right next to him, and he has to be learning all the time. Leman Yilmad Lirat Hashem Elakav, Lishmor Kol Divrei Torah Zot, Ve'Kim Lasot. Okay. Levilti rum levavo, so he shouldn't become arrogant, me'echav. Well, levilti sur min hamitzvah, he shouldn't become not religious. And in that way, yarich yamim al mamlachta. Okay, that's the halachas of the king. So let's talk about the king, because we're waiting for Melech HaMashiach to come. We would like a king already. We're tired of this whole, democratic, elect somebody, and then they, who do you elect? You elect the guy that you like. He's your next door neighbor. He's your cousin. He gives you a lot of money. He gives you rights. He gives you whatever. I think that the world right now is seeing that leadership is a very major topic in the world. The people who have leadership now, they want to continue their leadership as long as possible. They want to have a long life on their leadership. And the people who are being led are annoyed, and they're searching for the next person, the better person, whatever. They keep thinking that they'll elect somebody else who'll be better. Okay, so we have a tradition that Hashem is going to send us a holy king. This Melech HaMashiach. We had a few very righteous kings in Jewish history. Moshe Rabbeinu was the first. Yoshua was the second. And then we had, rulers, leaders, different halachic status of how much power they had and how much they were able to enforce halacha, or how much they were able to enforce, their whatever they wanted. And so the Torah tells us like this: if you talk about the king, so a king is a very practical matter. We know the whole story of how David HaMelech was anointed by Shmuel HaNavi. We know how Shaul HaMelech was anointed. So what was the problem with Shaul HaMelech? Shaul was Mashiach ben Yosef. He was a king. He was a righteous king. But he was anointed, excuse me. His kingship didn't last because of the intention of the kavanah of the people who wanted him as king. That was the problem with Shaul HaMelech. It wasn't that he wasn't righteous. And he didn't lose his kingship because he wasn't righteous. He lost his kingship because the people that he was ruling were not righteous. And their intention was off. So the intention behind a mitzvah here seems to have mattered very much. Ad kedei kach, to the point where he lost the leadership that we passed down to his children. He lost that because of the kavanah of the people. Now, that's an air element. The kavanah that you have, the thoughts that you have, is an air element. And normally we're not judged on our thoughts. We're only judged on our actions. Even though in Chassidus we're taught that the thought is actually a negative thought is actually very, very dangerous. There's a machlokas which is more dangerous, a negative thought or a negative action. Because a negative action is only an act of the body. A negative thought is in the pneumius of the person, is in the inner of the person. So there's back and forth. You're judged only on your actions, but your neshama is affected, or your spirituality is affected by the thoughts. And so here are the thoughts of a king. Don't have a king because you want to be like everybody else. I remember hearing years ago that one of the Israeli politicians said in the Labor Party, which is now defunct, no more Labor Party, or maybe there's like 2 or 3 people from it. But the original of the Labor Party was for all of the years in the Israeli government, and from the beginning of the state of Israel, the Labor was in charge until Likud took over. And so somebody in the Labor Party, I forgot who, said that his aim and goal for the land of Israel is it should be the Hong Kong of the Middle East. What an insult to the land of Israel, and what an insult to the Jewish people. That's not leadership. That's not Jewish leadership. The wrong intentions. And that might have been a very successful finance minister or prime minister or defense minister. I don't know who it was. Okay, let's learn about the kavana of the king. Also, I want to talk about the thoughts of the king, because it says here that the king can't have too many horses, can't have too many wives, can't have too much money. He has to have enough to be royal and dignified, but not too much that it will distract him. So, who was the one who thought he could get away with this? Shlomo HaMelech, right? Shlomo HaMelech said, I'm a chacham. Hashem told him that he's the chacham mikol adam. He's the smartest of all people. He's the one who's going to figure it all out. He understood the language of the animals. He could hear the angels talking. There was nothing that wasn't revealed to Shlomo HaMelech. Shlomo HaMelech and Moshe Rabbeinu. In the name Shlomo, you have the letters of Moshe. So Shlomo HaMelech figured like this. The reason it says not to have too many wives is because they're going to turn your heart astray. But I'm going to marry so many wives so that I will make a political alliance with every one of their families, right? Because what was marriages in those days? The marriage of a king. Shlomo HaMelech had one wife, Naamah. That was his soulmate. And from her came Rechavam, his heir. But then he had all of these political wives that he actually married in some kind of a ceremony, 1,000, it seems. And whether that number 1,000 is exaggerated or not, but it was a lot, certainly more than 18. And every one of those wives was a political alliance. It wasn't a love story, and it wasn't a relationship. It was all because Shlomo HaMelech had a plan. And his plan was, if I marry a princess, then her kingdom, her past kingdom, will fall under my influence spiritually. And in that way, I'll be able to conquer the whole world for Hashem. That was his kavanah. That was his air element. That was his thought. His action was wrong. His thought was okay. So here we see that he failed. Same thing with horses, same thing with money. So how did Hashem fix him? So there's a Agadata, there's a medrash that says that Shlomo HaMelech had this run-in with the king of the demons, and the king of the demons somehow took over, disguised himself, made himself look like Shlomo HaMelech and kicked Shlomo HaMelech to the other side of the world. And Shlomo HaMelech had no more money and no more wives and no more horses and no more anything. And he had to wander back to Eretz Yisrael. So however that was, whatever that was, we're seeing here an interesting thought, and that is, you can't outsmart God. Even when you're trying to work with God, you can't outsmart God. So the actual crowning of the king, the actual leadership of the king, was very, very practical. It was a very practical day. You know, David HaMelech, what he said in Tehillim, Chishafti derachai v'ashiva raglai el eid vosecha. Right? Chishafti derachai means I planned out my day. David HaMelech was a king. He had a whole tochnit. He wasn't sitting around, getting fanned, sitting like a Greek thing, sitting and popping grapes into his mouth and some slave fanning him. David HaMelech didn't sleep. He was so busy. He testified on himself. He never slept. He never had to wash Nagelwasser practically because he was so busy that he would fall asleep 20 seconds here, 10 minutes there. That's how he was. So, but he says that, so the Medrash says, David HaMelech had a whole plan. He had a government to run. He had things to do. He had wars to fight, generals to instruct, etc. But he ended up walking to the base medrash. So when we're going to learn this now in the backwards way, meaning normally people talk about this pasuk and they say, look at the greatness of David HaMelech, that as much as he had to do, his nature, his predisposition just pulled him back to learning. He couldn't drag himself away from the Torah. That's the way it's learned. But I just want to point out another fact, and that is David HaMelech had a whole to-do list. He had a whole long list of things to do. He was a king. You know, it says that David HaMelech would paskin shilas for women. He was so busy. So all day long, he was involved in the earth element of practicality. But he was able to infuse that with the air element. So here, with Shlomo HaMelech, there might have been a little bit of I'm not going to say a conflict, but Shlomo HaMelech thought to outsmart God. And David HaMelech, his father, he incorporated God. He never left God. When he was even doing his kingly duties, it was all with Hashem. It was all with Hashem in mind. Now, I want to jump to the end of the Parsha to talk about a very, very interesting halacha, a very practical halacha. Towards the end of the Parsha, it talks about if there's a war. Now, war is always a fire element because you're killing people. You're fighting. It's all war. It's all fire. So we know that before a war, before a milchemes reshus, before a war, the Torah tells us that the Kohen would go out and he would make a declaration. And he wanted to make sure that no one demoralizes anyone else. So there was a person there in the army, and this again is a voluntary war. In a milchemes mitzvah, there's a whole different halacha. But in a voluntary war, so the Kohen would make an announcement, and he would say, anybody who feels that they're unfit to fight can leave. And he gave a whole bunch of categories. The categories were somebody who got engaged or got married and didn't establish his house yet, somebody who built a house, didn't live in it yet, somebody who planted a field and didn't get the fruit from it yet. That's what they would announce. If anybody didn't do any of these things, they can leave the battlefield, because what if you die? Then somebody else will take your work, and it will be sad. And then the last thing it says is, and if a person's afraid, they can also leave the battlefield, because you don't want to frighten anyone else. So the Chazal tell us that really, that there's a discussion in the Gemara about what this means, but basically, the whole point of all of these announcements was just to make sure that you have that a person who is afraid but is embarrassed to say it can leave. You know, peer pressure was in those days also. If you have an army of people going out to war, then and it's a voluntary war, so why should you volunteer? If you're afraid, just don't volunteer. But I guess people felt pressured. And so, but the army did not want people who were afraid to be in the army, because it would demoralize everyone else. So there was a whole tekes, a whole ceremony of these announcements made by the Kohen, and then afterwards the generals would take over, that anybody can leave who doesn't want to be here. But basically that was all for the intention of to just get rid of the person, give him a way out. And that's so much in terms of the respecting and the honor of a person. It's respecting and honoring a person. And here you're not talking about a person who's on the highest level. You're talking about a person who doesn't have enough emunah bitachon, because we know that all the wars fought in biblical times, especially when Moshe Rabbeinu and Yehoshua were directing the war, they all basically won. As long as the Jewish people kept the halachas, they basically won. So we're talking about preserving the dignity of another person, and that's also a very strong air element. Because the air element and the person is the air and the fire is a part that needs and wants dignity. There are certain people who they don't care. They don't need kavod, they don't need honor, it's just not a thing for them. It just doesn't do anything for them. But a fire person needs honor. and acknowledgement. And a person is the air element in the person is the element that needs acknowledgement, and the fire element in the person also needs acknowledgement. And here the Torah is bending over backwards to give these people a way of not losing their dignity. And again, I think it's so interesting because of what happens in the news about the governor of New York, who had to be in the most undignified, situation. And whether these things happened or not, it doesn't matter. Whether he was, how whatever his behavior was, in actuality, is not ever going to be known. But the concept, the idea that people are not happy with you and are insulting you for doing an immoral act. Now you might say they also do immoral acts. That's also true. But the idea in the eyes of the Jewish people right now, because the Gemara says that everything that happens in the world is for us, is a lesson for us. So the lesson I heard is like, well, the leaders are being called up to a higher. They should be called up to a normal or a high standard. The fact that it happened in Shoftim is, to me, very interesting. We have our own problems here in Eretz Yisrael with our own leaders, or with the people who have assumed leadership here. And all we want already is the king in the Parsha. We want the king, we want Melech Mashiach to come, and to help us to worship Hashem Melech, Hashem Malach, Hashem Yimlach in the Beis Hamikdash. That's these Parsha, the three mitzvahs of the king in this week's Parsha. We would like to see it already, Bezrat Hashem. So I wish you a good Shabbos. Yeah, what do you want to ask?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
So it looks as if Shlomo was being practical. He was earth-based and he was air-based. He was in the world of thoughts. He said, I can do this thing. I understand the thinking. But he didn't connect to the fact that there was an emotional element and a spiritual element.
So he didn't think, the Gemara says that he didn't think that they would sway his heart.
Right. So he didn't think that the emotions or the spiritual aspect of him could be shifted because he was so filled with the world of ideas and practical ideas.
That's a nice that's a nice interpretation. That's a very nice interpretation. He was in his head. I don't know about the practical aspect, because the practical aspect,
Well, practical aspect.
His practical aspect was really more manifest in the building of the Beis Hamikdash and the building of the Beis Hamikdash. That was his practical aspect. And
if each wife was a merger, then that's very practical.
Right, that's true. But that was for his intention. His intention was, right? Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. It's a nice, listen, we can't talk about Shlomo Melech. If we would meet Shlomo Melech, we would think he's God. That's how holy he was in relation to us. Just like the angels thought that Adam HaRishon was God. But on what Chazal tell us about, we can just, the bottom line for us is we can't rationalize when we think the Torah says to do something. We shouldn't think that we're smarter than God.
Right, but isn't the idea here that I should use it for my own good, that I should understand my own behavior in terms of trying to go too much into my head and not realizing that there's a whole emotional element that needs to be taken care of?
That's true. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, have a great Shabbos.
Great class.